The woods keep their secrets well. Every year, millions of people pack their gear, load their cars, and disappear into America's forests and national parks. Not because anything has gone wrong, but because the wilderness calls to something ancient in all of us. Most of them come back. They return to their cars, their families, their ordinary lives, carrying nothing but memories and mosquito bites. But some don't come back. And the strangest cases, the ones that linger long after the search parties have gone home, are not the ones where someone fell down a cliff or wandered too far in a storm. The strangest cases are the ones where no explanation ever comes, where trained search dogs lose a scent in the middle of a trail, where hundreds of searchers comb through every square mile and find nothing, where the last moment someone is seen feels completely normal. A child ducking behind a bush, a woman walking ahead of her friends, and then they are simply gone. Today, we're going to look at 3 of those cases. 3 people, 3 different parks, 3 different decades, and 3 disappearances that no matter how many times investigators, researchers, and families have gone over the details, still don't make sense. My name is Donald Hinshelwood, and this is what we know. Dennis Martin.
The Great Smoky Mountains sit on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina like something out of an older world. The peaks don't cut sharp against the sky the way younger mountains do. They roll, they fold into each other, ridge after ridge, disappearing into a blue-gray haze that gave them their name long before Europeans ever set foot on them. The Cherokee called this place Shakanagi, the place of blue smoke. And if you've ever stood at the edge of Spence Field on a clear morning and watched the mist rise off those valleys, you understand why. It is one of the most visited national parks in America. Over 12 million people pass through it every year. Families, hikers, photographers, people who come for the fall leaves and stay for the quiet. It is also a place where, if you walk far enough from the trail, the quiet becomes something else entirely. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, the Martin family did what they did every year. They packed their gear and drove out to the Smokies. It was a tradition, a male family tradition. William Martin, his father Clyde, and William's 2 sons, 9-year-old Douglas and 6-year-old Dennis. Dennis Lloyd Martin, born June 20th, 1962, which means that weekend in the mountains he was 6 years old, 6 days away from turning 7. His family described him as a quiet boy, gentle, the kind of child who stayed close, who didn't wander, who trusted the adults around him completely. It was his first overnight camping trip. He was wearing a bright red t-shirt. The first day went without incident. The family hiked from Cades Cove up to Russell Field, where they camped overnight in one of the trail shelters. By all accounts, it was a good day. Dennis kept pace with the older hikers. The mountains were doing what the mountains do in June, green and warm and full of light. The next morning, June 14th, they set out east along the Appalachian Trail towards Spence Field, a highland meadow. Open, grassy, panoramic, the kind of place where you can see for miles in every direction and feel, for a moment, like the world is entirely manageable. At Spence Field, the Martins met up with another family they knew, also, by coincidence, named Martin. The adults settled in, the children drifted toward each other the way children do, and before long, Dennis, his brother Douglas, and 2 boys from the other family had formed a small conspiratorial huddle. They were planning a prank. The plan was simple. The boys would sneak up on the adults from different directions and jump out, yelling, the kind of thing that delights 6-year-olds and mildly startles fathers. The older boys would approach from one side. Dennis, because his bright red shirt would give away his position, was told to circle around and come from a different angle, a longer route, through the trees up near the Appalachian Trail. William Martin watched his youngest son duck behind a bush at the edge of the tree line. He never saw him again. A few minutes passed. The older boys burst out of the grass laughing. The adults played along, startled cries, dramatic reactions, and then someone looked around. Dennis hadn't come out. At first, William wasn't worried. Children lose track of time. Maybe he'd gotten turned around. Maybe he was still hiding, waiting for his moment. William called his name, walked the trail west toward Russell Field, calling the whole way, came back, called again. Silence. By the time Clyde Martin hiked all the way down to the Cades Cove Ranger Station to raise the alarm, it was 8:30 in the evening. Dennis had been missing for 4 hours. And then the storm came. That night, the sky over the Smokies opened up. 3 inches of rain in a matter of hours. The trails turned to mud. The temperature dropped into the 50s. And somewhere out in that darkness, a 6-year-old boy in a red t-shirt and Oxford shoes was either moving or he wasn't. The search began at 5 the following morning with 30 people. By the end of that first day, it had grown to 240, and it kept growing. Park rangers, college students, firefighters, Boy Scouts, sheriff's deputies, 60 United States Army Green Berets, helicopters dispatched from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia, heat-seeking equipment, tracking dogs. At its peak, over 1,400 people were searching 56 square miles of mountain terrain. It was, and still is, the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a torn piece of red fabric caught on a branch, not a single trace. On June 20th, what would have been Dennis's 7th birthday, nearly 800 searchers combed the mountains looking for him. The Red Cross set up food stations. The national media arrived. His father, William, spoke through a bullhorn on the ridgelines, calling his son's name into the trees. The trees gave nothing back. The official search was wound down on June 29th. A final effort was made by 3 experienced rangers and quietly closed on September 13, 1969. The total cost of the search came to $50,000. 13,000 hours of combined effort. No trace of Dennis Martin was ever found. But here is where the case stops being a tragedy and starts being something harder to explain. In the days after Dennis vanished, searchers did find something, a set of child-sized footprints near the west prong of the Little Pigeon River, an area that had already been searched. The prints were noted and then dismissed. Investigators assumed they belonged to one of the Boy Scout volunteers, but those volunteers were later accounted for. No scout had been barefoot in that area, and no child involved in the search had been missing a shoe. Days later, a single shoe and sock were recovered. The details of exactly where were not widely reported. Then there is the ginseng hunter. Years after the disappearance, a man came forward with a story. He had been illegally harvesting ginseng in the park, a federal offense, and during one of his trips, somewhere in the area of Big Hollow near Tremont, he had come across the scattered skeletal remains of what appeared to be a small child. He said nothing. For 16 years he said nothing because he was afraid of being prosecuted for the illegal ginseng. In 1985, he finally contacted a ranger. A team of 30 experienced rescuers searched the area he described. They found nothing. The location he provided was not far from where the footprints had been discovered, but whether the remains he saw belonged to Dennis Martin or to anyone will never be confirmed. And then there is Harold Key. Harold Key was a highway engineer from Carthage, Tennessee. On the afternoon of June 14, 1969, he was in the park with his family near an area called Rowan's Creek, Sea Branch, roughly 7 miles from Spence Field.
Around 5 in the evening, Key heard a sound he would spend years trying to forget. He described it as a sickening scream, not an animal, not a bird, something that made his wife spin around, convinced one of their own children had been attacked by a bear. Within minutes of the scream, Key spotted a figure moving rapidly through the trees, not running exactly, but moving fast, deliberately. The figure was a man, large, disheveled, unkempt in a way that Key found disturbing, moving in a direction that suggested he was actively trying not to be seen. Key's son initially thought it was a bear. It was not a bear. The man had something slung over his shoulder, something large, something, and this detail was not released to the press at the time, that appeared to be red. The Key family left the park without knowing anything about a missing child. They drove home. Days later, watching the news, Harold Key heard about Dennis Martin, about the red shirt, about the search. He called the Park Service immediately. Investigators listened and then quietly set the account aside. The distance, they said, was too great. 7 miles of mountain terrain in under an hour, impossible. But veteran park ranger Dwight McCarter didn't accept that answer. He hiked the route himself, Spence Field to Rowan's Creek, and completed it in approximately 90 minutes. Dennis's own father, William, later hiked the same route with a ranger in roughly the same time. The FBI was involved in the case. When William Martin eventually learned about the Key sighting, not from investigators, but from a reporter, he was furious. The Bureau had agreed to share all information gathered during the search. They had not told him about the scream. They had not told him about the man. They had not told him about the red object. The FBI's official position was that the sighting was too distant and the timeline too unclear to be relevant. Dwight McCarter, in interviews given decades later, said something that has stayed with researchers ever since. During the search, somewhere along the West Prong Trail, he detected what he believed was the smell of decomposition. He was not permitted to investigate further. The area had, he was told, already been searched. He has never stopped wondering about that.
In the years since 1969, several theories have been examined, and none of them fully satisfy. The first is the most straightforward. Dennis got lost. He took the wrong direction through the trees, disoriented himself, and in the dark and the rain, exhausted and frightened, he succumbed to exposure. The terrain in that part of the Smokies is unforgiving. Steep ravines, dense undergrowth, fast-moving streams. A 6-year-old, even a capable one, could disappear into it without a trace. The problem with this theory is the absence, not just of a body, but of anything. 13,000 hours of searching and not a piece of red fabric, not a bone, not a shoe. In country that dense, with that many searchers, the total absence of any physical evidence is deeply unusual. The second theory is animal predation. Black bears, bobcats, and feral pigs all inhabit the Smokies. 1969 was a dry summer, and there were reports of animals ranging further than usual in search of food. An animal large enough to take a child, however, would almost certainly leave evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks. Wildlife experts at the time were skeptical. None have ever pointed to an animal encounter as a plausible explanation. The third theory is abduction. This is the theory Dennis's father, William, believed until his death. The Key sighting sits at the center of it. The scream, the unkempt man, the red object over his shoulder. Researcher and author David Paulides, who has extensively documented unexplained disappearances in national parks under the banner of the Missing 411 Project, has cited the Dennis Martin case as one of the most troubling in his research. Paulides notes the pattern: a child gone in seconds, in an open area, in daylight, with family nearby. No trace, no remains, no explanation. The FBI reviewed the abduction theory and found no evidence to support it. They found no suspects, no persons of interest, no connection to any known offender in the area. There is a fourth theory. It lives in the stranger corners of the internet. Feral people, wild men in the mountains, things that don't have names. The ranger community around the Smokies has its own quiet lore about the hollows and the ridgelines and what has been seen up there over the years. Most investigators dismiss this entirely, but some don't. What remains after 56 years is a 6-year-old boy in a red shirt stepping behind a bush in Spence Field on a June afternoon, and then nothing. No cry. No struggle, no trail leading anywhere. Just the woods, closing in behind him like a door. Dennis Lloyd Martin was 6 years old. He would be 62 today. His case remains open. His family never stopped looking for answers. And the mountains, as they always have, are keeping whatever they know entirely to themselves.
Thelma Pauline Melton. 12 years passed. The Smokies didn't change. They never do. The same ridgelines, the same hollows, the same heavy green silence that swallows sound and distance and sometimes people. By 1981, the Dennis Martin case had faded from the national headlines. The search had been closed for over a decade. The mountains had moved on, the way mountains do, indifferent to the questions left behind them. Hikers still came by the millions. Families still set up tents in the campgrounds, still walked the trails, still stood at the overlooks and took photographs of the mist. On the North Carolina side of the park, near a small town called Bryson City, there is a trail called Deep Creek. It is not a dramatic trail. It doesn't summit anything. It doesn't demand technical skill or serious equipment. It runs parallel to the creek for which it is named, a gentle, gravel-lined path through the trees, popular with families and older visitors and anyone who wants to spend an afternoon in the woods without working too hard for it. It was, by every measure, one of the safest trails in the park. Thelma Pauline Melton had been walking it for nearly 20 years. Everyone called her Polly. She was 58 years old in the fall of 1981. Auburn hair, brown eyes behind a pair of glasses she rarely took off. A warm, generous woman, the kind who shows up. Every day, without fail, she volunteered at the Bryson City Nutrition Center, serving meals to senior citizens. She was friendly with her neighbors, active in her church, known to the people around the campground as reliable, present, constant. She and her husband, Robert, Bob, lived in Jacksonville, Florida for the most of the year. But every autumn, they drove their Airstream trailer up to the Smokies and stayed for a few months. It had become as much a ritual for them as the Martins' Father's Day hike had been for that family. The mountains in fall, the leaves turning, the air going cool and clean. Polly loved it. Bob was nearly 20 years older than his wife, and his health had declined to the point where he could no longer join her on the trails. So Polly hiked with friends. Always on easy paths, always on routes she knew well. On September 25, 1981, she set out on Deep Creek Trail with two of those friends, Pauline Cannon and Trula Gudger. Bob stayed behind at the trailer. Before she left, Polly made the sauce for the spaghetti she planned to cook for dinner that evening. She took a short nap. She got ready the way she always did. She was wearing a pink and white striped sleeveless blouse, tan polyester pants, low-cut tan shoes with crepe soles, the left one with a distinctive crack across the ball of the foot, the kind that would leave an identifiable print in soft ground. She had her cigarettes, 2 packs a day of Virginia Slims. She never went anywhere without them. She did not have her identification, no cash, no medications for the high blood pressure and nausea she was being treated for, no car keys. She had been prohibited from driving that summer, and the keys to the Airstream were with Bob. She had no reason not to come back. Dinner was already started.
Her husband was waiting. The trail was one she could have walked in her sleep. The three women set off around 3 in the afternoon. It was, by all accounts, an easy, pleasant hike. They talked and joked the way old friends do on familiar ground. At some point during the walk, Polly's companions teased her for her pace. She was moving more slowly than usual that day. Polly laughed it off. About an hour in, at roughly 4 o'clock, they reached the halfway point of the trail and turned back toward the campground. They had been walking for perhaps half a mile on the return when something changed. Polly began to walk faster. Not jogging, just quickening her stride, pulling ahead of her friends with a purposefulness that seemed to come from nowhere. One of her companions called out after her, laughing, "I wouldn't want to be in a foot race with you, Polly." Polly turned. She looked back at her friends. She laughed, and then she kept walking. She crested a small hill on the trail, a gentle rise in the gravel path, and stepped down the other side. Her friends followed perhaps 30 seconds behind her. When they came over the hill, Polly Melton was gone. Not around a bend, not sitting on one of the wooden benches placed along the trail for resting hikers, not visible ahead in either direction on a path that ran straight and open for a considerable distance. Gone. Her companions stood there for a moment, confused. Then they assumed she must have decided to push ahead to the campground on her own. Maybe she'd wanted to check on Bob. Maybe she'd felt unwell. They walked the rest of the trail back at their own pace and arrived at the campground around 4:30. Bob had not seen her. He had been inside the trailer the entire time. Polly had not come back. They reported her missing to a park ranger at 6 o'clock, 2 hours after she disappeared. A search was organized. 150 volunteers joined park rangers over the following days. 9 trained search and rescue dogs were brought in. The dogs found her scent immediately, right at the spot where her friends had last seen her, the crest of that small hill on Deep Creek Trail. The dogs reacted strongly, circling and tracking, clearly on something real. And then they stopped. The scent simply ended, right there at the top of the rise, on a well-traveled gravel path in a park visited by millions of people. The dogs circled, they howled, and they went nowhere because there was nowhere to go. No trail leading into the woods on either side. No indication that anyone had left the path. No broken branches, no disturbed earth. On one side of the trail was Deep Creek, shallow that year due to drought, easily crossable but leaving no evidence of crossing. On the other, a steep ridge. The search continued for 5 days. On October 2nd, 1981, it was officially concluded. Not a single trace of Thelma Pauline Melton had been found. The evening of the day she disappeared, Bob was told his wife was missing. The news was so devastating that he suffered a stroke. He spent the rest of his life in a nursing facility, never knowing what happened to the woman he had driven those mountains with every autumn for years. The strangeness of Polly Melton's disappearance is not in one dramatic detail. It is in the accumulation of small things that don't sit right, details that, taken individually, have explanations, but taken together, form a picture with too many missing pieces. Start with the day before she vanished. Polly had volunteered at the nutrition center in Bryson City for 4 years. In all that time, she had never used the center's telephone, not once. But on September 24th, the day before she disappeared, she placed several calls from the center's phone to an unknown individual. Investigators were never able to trace those calls. No one has ever identified who she was calling or why. The day of the disappearance, she skipped her volunteer shift entirely, something she almost never did. The reason she gave was unclear. Her minister told investigators that Polly had been struggling. Her mother had died earlier that year, and the grief had settled heavily on her. He also told investigators, carefully and without certainty, that he believed Polly may have been having an affair. There is no confirmed evidence of this, but it was noted. Then there is the Valium. Polly had been prescribed Valium in 1979 as a muscle relaxant and was believed to have stopped taking it by 1981. After she disappeared, Bob discovered that his own prescription of Valium was missing. It was never determined whether Polly had taken it, or when, or how much. And then, in April of 1982, 7 months after Polly vanished, a check made out in her name was written and cashed in Birmingham, Alabama. Investigators looked into it. The trail went cold almost immediately. It was never explained.
Polly Melton's case sits at a strange crossroads between accident and intention, between tragedy and mystery, and the theories reflect that tension. The first possibility is a medical event. Polly had high blood pressure. She was a heavy smoker. She was overweight and on medication. It is possible that she experienced a sudden cardiac event or a stroke at the top of that hill, fell, rolled into the undergrowth, and was simply never found. The Smokies are dense enough that a body in the right conditions could go undiscovered for a very long time. But the search dogs found no scent trail leading anywhere, no evidence of anyone leaving the path, no indication that a body had fallen into the brush on either side, and the check cashed in Birmingham 7 months later complicates this theory considerably. The second possibility is that Polly left deliberately. The phone calls no one can identify, the affair her minister suspected, the missing Valium, the skipped volunteer shift, the purposeful acceleration up the trail, the wave, the laugh, and then gone. Some investigators and researchers have suggested that Polly Melton walked over that hill towards something she had arranged, a meeting, a person, a new life. It is not a comfortable theory, but it is the one the evidence quietly points toward in some interpretations. The cashed check in Birmingham in particular is difficult to explain any other way. The third possibility is foul play. A populated trail, in daylight, with her friends 30 seconds behind her. The window seems impossibly small. But windows don't need to be large. They only need to be large enough. There were other people on Deep Creek Trail that afternoon. A car, a path off the trail that no one noticed being taken. Someone waiting just over that hill. David Paulides, in his Missing 411 research, has pointed to the Polly Melton case as one that carries hallmarks he finds repeatedly in his documentation of wilderness disappearances. The sudden behavioral change immediately before vanishing, the dogs losing the scent at the precise point of last contact, the total absence of any physical evidence, and the location. Always near water, always in a crease in the terrain, a hill, a valley, a bend just out of sight of the people who were there, just out of sight. And then there is the question no theory fully answers. How does a 58-year-old woman on a gravel path in open terrain with friends 30 seconds behind her simply stop existing? The dogs were right there, her scent was right there, and then it wasn't. Park Ranger Chuck Harris told a reporter at the time, "We are just puzzled at this point." That was 1981. 45 years later, the puzzle has not been solved.
Gilbert Gilman. We leave the Smokies now. We leave Tennessee and North Carolina and the blue-gray haze of those ancient folded mountains. We travel west, all the way to the northwestern edge of the country, to a place where the land meets the Pacific and the rainforest grows so thick and so wet that the trees wear moss like coats, and the light, even at midday, arrives filtered and green and strange. Olympic National Park sits on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. It is one of the most biologically diverse places in North America. Temperate rainforest, alpine meadow, and over 70 miles of wild coastline, all within the same park boundary. It is enormous, remote, the kind of place where the terrain does not forgive mistakes. steep rocky hills, dense ancient forest, rivers that run fast and cold out of the mountains, valleys where the canopy closes so completely overhead that you can lose the sky entirely. Between 1995 and 2006, there were 42 searches for lost hikers in the eastern section of Olympic National Park alone. 4 of those searches ended in confirmed fatalities. 1 ended with the person never found. In the 1980s, 2 separate hikers went missing in the staircase area of the park. Neither was ever found. This is the context into which Gilbert Mark Gilman walked on the morning of June 24, 2006. Gil Gilman was not the kind of man you worried about in the wilderness. He was 47 years old, 5'7", graying brown hair, brown eyes behind prescription glasses he needed badly. Without them, he was nearly blind. He was physically fit, calm under pressure, and possessed of a set of skills most people will never come close to acquiring. He had served as a United States Army paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the most demanding combat roles in the military. He had earned 2 Bronze Stars. He had served in Panama, East Africa, and Israel. He had worked in embassies in Yemen and Mongolia. He had deployed to Iraq as a civilian contractor working in counterterrorism and counterintelligence.
He was a trained military interrogator, fluent, not conversational, fluent in Arabic, Russian, and Chinese. He had also worked with the United Nations and been active in international politics, traveling to Belgium, the United Kingdom, Kuwait, Somalia, China, and beyond. By the time he disappeared, he had moved to Washington State from New York and was serving as Deputy Director of the Washington State Department of Retirement Systems, a senior government position managing billions of dollars in public pension funds. He was, by every measure, a man who had seen things, done things, survived things. On the morning of June 24th, Gil Gilman got into his silver 2005 Ford Thunderbird convertible and drove to the Staircase Ranger Station at the edge of Olympic National Park. He was wearing a bright blue and green Hawaiian shirt, khaki shorts, flip-flops. He was carrying a camera. He had no backpack, no water, no supplies. He was, by all appearances, going for a short, casual walk. The kind of thing you do on a Saturday morning when the weather is good and you want some fresh air before the rest of the day begins. He had a meeting in Spokane the following morning, a work trip with his colleague, Sandy Matheson, the department director. He would be back in time. At the Staircase Ranger Station, Gil pulled into the parking lot. Ranger Lustig was nearby when she heard music coming from his car, loud enough that she stepped outside to see what was going on. She and Gil had a brief conversation. She asked him to turn the music down. He did. She got the sense he was heading out for a hike. That was the last time anyone saw Gilbert Mark Gilman. The next morning, June 25th, Gil did not show up for his meeting in Spokane. Sandy Matheson waited, called, got no answer, reported him missing. A few days later, his silver Thunderbird was found exactly where Ranger Lustig had last seen it, still parked at the Staircase Ranger Station, sitting in the lot as though its owner had simply stepped away for a moment and would be back any minute. He was not back. The search that followed was extensive. 62 searchers on the ground, working the trails and ridges around the staircase area, tracking dogs, a helicopter, a plane equipped with heat-seeking FLIR technology that could detect the warmth of a human body through forest canopy. They searched for 10 days. The terrain around Staircase is not forgiving. Steep, rocky hills thick with old-growth forest, the North Fork Skokomish River running fast and cold through the valley below, ravines that drop suddenly and without warning, the kind of country where a man in flip-flops and prescription sunglasses with no water and no supplies would be in serious trouble within hours. After 10 days, the search was called off. No trace of Gilbert Gilman had been found.
No camera, no shoe, no piece of clothing caught on a branch. Nothing. His case was officially closed. He was declared legally dead in 2015, 9 years after he walked away from his car. His bank accounts, however, are still being monitored. The strangeness of Gil Gilman's case begins with the man himself, a former paratrooper, a military interrogator with 2 Bronze Stars and deployments across 3 continents, a man fluent in the languages of America's most sensitive geopolitical relationships, Arabic, Russian, Chinese, a man who had worked in counterterrorism and counterintelligence, a man whose career had taken him through embassies in countries most people couldn't find on a map. Men with that profile do not, as a rule, simply wander into the woods in flip-flops and vanish. In 2008, Seattle's Cairo TV ran an investigative segment on the Gilman disappearance. Their reporting described a man who had, in their words, led a mysterious life and taken top-secret military intelligence assignments. When the station contacted Gil's mother, Doris Gilman, she made a striking request. She asked them to hold the story, or at minimum to handle it with extreme care. Her concern was not grief. Her concern was operational. She believed her son might be alive. She believed he might have gone underground deliberately as part of an intelligence operation. She was afraid that broadcasting his story publicly might, in her words, blow his cover.
At her request, the Cairo TV team contacted several agencies connected to the Department of Defense before the segment aired. None of those agencies confirmed or denied anything. His bank accounts have never shown any activity, but they are still being watched, a detail that suggests investigators have not entirely dismissed the possibility that Gil Gilman is alive, somewhere, by choice. And then there is Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes was, by the FBI's own assessment, one of the most methodical and dangerous serial killers in American history. He planned his crimes years in advance. He cached weapons and supplies in remote locations across the country, buried kill kits in national parks waiting for him to return and use them. He targeted strangers deliberately in places where he had no connection to the victim, specifically to eliminate any forensic trail. He traveled thousands of miles to commit murders, then returned home and lived quietly. He told investigators he killed at least 11 people between 2001 and 2012, though the true number may be higher. He committed suicide in custody in Anchorage in December 2012 after admitting to the abduction and murder of 18-year-old barista Samantha Koenig. From 2001 to 2007, the years surrounding Gil Gilman's disappearance, Israel Keyes lived in Nia Bay, Washington, on the Olympic Peninsula, approximately 4 hours from the Staircase Ranger Station.
He was an avid hiker. He obtained backcountry permits for Olympic National Park in both 2005 and 2006, permits that gave him legal access to the park's most remote areas. He was known to hunt his victims in wilderness settings and remote locations. On June 11, 2006, 13 days before Gil Gilman disappeared, Israel Keyes placed 90th in the Olympic Discovery Marathon in Port Angeles, Washington. He was in the area. He had access to the park. He was off work on Saturdays, the same day of the week Gil Gilman went missing. And he was precisely the kind of killer who would have targeted an isolated man on a quiet trail, left no evidence, and driven home. In 2014, the investigative discovery television program, Dark Minds, hosted by investigative journalist M. William Phelps, dedicated a 2-hour episode to the theory that Israel Keyes had killed Gilbert Gilman. The case was compelling enough to air nationally. The FBI's response was careful. Special Agent Kevin Donovan of the Anchorage office stated publicly that investigators found it highly unlikely that Keyes was connected to Gilman's disappearance, but notably declined to specify what evidence led them to that conclusion. He also acknowledged that standard investigative procedure would absolutely require looking into any connection between an active serial killer and a disappearance in the same region. They looked. They won't say what they found. Gilman's case has produced theories that range from the straightforwardly tragic to the genuinely extraordinary. And what makes it unusual is that several of them are simultaneously plausible. The first is accident. A man in flip-flops and prescription sunglasses with no supplies in terrain that has claimed multiple lives. He wanders off the trail, he falls, he goes into the river. The Olympic backcountry is vast and unforgiving enough that a body weighted down by water or buried under a fallen tree could go undiscovered indefinitely. 10 days of searching with 62 people and aerial equipment found nothing. But Olympic National Park is nearly 1 million acres of some of the densest wilderness on the continent. The problem with this theory is Gil himself. A man with his training, his experience, his physical fitness, going into serious trouble on what appeared to be a 2.1-mile, well-maintained trail near the ranger station? It is possible. People with far more experience than Gil have died in far more manageable terrain. But it sits uneasily. The second theory is voluntary disappearance. This is the theory Gil's own family has leaned toward, and the one that keeps his bank accounts under monitoring. A man with his intelligence background would know how to vanish. He would know how to construct a disappearance that looked accidental. He would know that leaving a car at a trailhead, wearing casual clothes, carrying only a camera, it reads as a day hike, not a planned exit. His mother's conviction that he was alive and working undercover has never been publicly shaken. The Department of Defense agencies contacted by KIRO-TV said nothing, which, depending on your interpretation, means either there was nothing to say or everything. The third theory is Israel Keys. The proximity, the timing, the access to the park, the methodology, isolated victim, remote location, no witnesses, no evidence. Keys was meticulous in a way that most killers are not. He once told FBI investigators that he specifically chose victims with no connection to him in places where he had no connection to the crime to make investigation impossible. If Keys killed Gilbert Gilman, it would look exactly like what it looks like now, a man who walked into the woods and was never seen again. The FBI says it's unlikely. They won't say why. David Paulides, who has documented Gilbert Gilman's case within the Missing 411 framework, notes a pattern he finds significant. A person with an unusual or high-profile background disappearing in a national park in conditions that don't match the profile of a typical wilderness accident, leaving no physical evidence with a search that yields nothing. Paulides does not offer a single explanation for what causes these disappearances. He says carefully that the field of suspects is narrowing. He leaves the rest to the listener. And there is a fourth dimension to this case that none of the other theories fully address. Gilbert Gilman was deputy director of the Washington State Pension Fund, a position with oversight of billions of dollars in public money. He had a background in counterintelligence. He had lived and worked in some of the most sensitive diplomatic environments in the world. He spoke the languages of America's most complex geopolitical relationships. People like that accumulate things over the course of a career: knowledge, contacts, debts of various kinds, secrets that belong to other people. Whether any of that is relevant to what happened on June 24, 2006, nobody has said publicly. Maybe it isn't relevant at all. Or maybe a man with that profile walks into the woods in flip-flops without a reason.